A century-old unsolved axe murder. 8 people hacked to death.
These days, many curiosity seekers from eastern Iowa make that 200-mile trip west to see the home where it happened.
As soon as Ross Moore walked in here, he seen 2 bodies under a sheet, the sheet pulled tight and blood on the sheet. He had no idea who it was. He just ran out, didn't go upstairs. He said, "You need to get somebody here right now. Something horrible's happened."
Mary Catherine Moore invited Ina May and Lena Gertrude Stillinger to stay the night at their place after attending church in the Children's Day program, which the mother of Mary Catherine Moore, Sarah, had coordinated. After around 9:30 p.m., the Moores and the Stillinger sisters walked to the Moore residence, arriving between 9:45 and 10 p.m. This part of the story is not contested to the happenings of this dreadful evening. Around 7 a.m. the next morning, June 10th, Mary Beckham, the Moore's neighbor, noticed the family had not come out to begin their morning chores and became worried. She went over and began to knock, and when no one answered, she tried to open the door, but it was locked. She let the family chicken out and called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. When Ross, the brother, received no response, he used a spare key to open the door. He then went into the parlor and found Ina and Lena Stillinger. This is what Ross told Henry Han Horton, the peace officer of Villisca. Horton's search revealed the entire Moore family had been slain and bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon? An axe, which had belonged to Josiah, being found in the guest room alongside the Stillinger sisters. Doctors then concluded that the murders had happened between midnight and 5 a.m. Though the tale gets told that 2 cigarettes had been smoked in the basement, where it is believed that the killer or killers waited until the family went to sleep to attack, but in the official report it does not mention this. What is believed is that the killer or killers started in the master bedroom, attacking Josiah first and actually striking him with the sharp end of the axe, and bludgeoning him multiple times so viciously that his eyes was removed from his skull. Sarah was then bludgeoned to death with the blunt end of the axe. Every other victim was killed with the blunt end and not the sharp end of the weapon. The ceiling of the master bedroom had a giant chunk missing from the swing of the axe. After inflicting punishment and ultimately death on Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul, the killer or killers returned to the master bedroom to inflict more damage to Josiah. The killer or killers then went downstairs to kill the 2 guests. After killing the children, that was over for the night, the killer or killers took a 4-pound slab of bacon from the icebox and laid it next to the axe. Investigators also found untouched food and water during the initial search. Investigators believe that all the victims, except Lena, was asleep during the murders. They think she was awake because of the way she was found laying with a defensive wound on her forearm. Her undergarments had also been removed, and she had been raped by the assailant. The suspects. There was more than a few suspects. The first to be questioned was Andrew Sawyer, transient/stranger that was interrogated but not charged. Frank F. Jones. Frank Fernando Jones was a Villisca resident and an Iowa state senator. Joseph Moore had worked for Frank Jones at his implement store for many years before leaving to open his own store. Moore reportedly took business away from Jones, including a very successful John Deere dealership, which would give Jones motive. Moore was rumored to have had a sexual affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, though no evidence supports this. William Blackie Mansfield. Another theory was that Senator Jones hired William Blackie Mansfield to murder the Moore family. 9 months before the murders, a similar case occurred in Colorado Springs, Colorado. The cases were similar enough to raise the possibility of having been committed by the same person. Other murders reported linked to these crimes included numerous unsolved axe murders along the Southern Pacific Railroad from 1911 and 1912, the unsolved Axeman of New Orleans killings, as well as several other murders during this time period. The murders in Colorado Springs were closely related in execution to those in the Moore house. Bed sheets were used to cover the windows to prevent passerbyers from looking in. As at the Moore house in Villisca, the murderer in Colorado Springs wiped the blood off his axe and covered the heads of the victims with bedcloths. The murderer hung aprons and skirts to cover the windows. Mansfield was also the prime suspect of the Burns Detective Agency of Kansas City and Detective James Newton Wilkerson, who suggested that he was a cocaine-addicted serial killer. According to the contemporary news reports, Wilkerson believed Mansfield was responsible for the ex-murders of his wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law in Blue Island, Illinois on July 5, 1914. According to Wilkerson's investigation, all of the murders were committed in precisely the same manner, indicating that the same man probably committed them. Wilkerson stated that he could prove Mansfield was present in each of the differing crimes on the night of the murders. In each murder, the victims were hacked to death with an axe and the mirrors in the homes were covered. In each case, the murderer avoided leaving fingerprints by wearing gloves, which Wilkerson believed was strong evidence that the man was Mansfield, who knew his fingerprints were on file at the federal military prison in Leavenworth. Wilkerson managed to convince a grand jury to open an investigation in 1916, and Mansfield was arrested and brought to Montgomery County from Kansas City. Payroll records, however, provided an alibi that placed Mansfield in Illinois the time of the Villisca murders. He was released for a lack of evidence and later won a lawsuit he brought against Wilkerson and was rewarded $2,225. Wilkerson believed that pressure from Jones resulted not only in Mansfield's release, but also the arrest and trial of Reverend Kelly. Kelly was an English-born traveling minister in the town on the night of the murders. Kelly was described as peculiar. It was reported that he had suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent. As an adult, he was accused of peeping and several times asking young women and girls to pose nude for him. So there was reason to maybe believe this Reverend could have been responsible for these crimes. Even stranger, Kelly actually confessed to the murders later in court, but the jury didn't believe him. In the weeks that followed, he displayed a fascination with the case and wrote many letters to the police, investigators, and family of the deceased. This aroused suspicion. His mental illness made authorities question whether he knew details because he had committed the crimes or because he had imagined them. 2 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail. He was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the National Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. Investigators speculated again that Kelly could be the murderer of the Moore family. In another strange twist years later, in 1917, Kelly was arrested for the Villisca murders. Police obtained a confession from him. However, it followed many hours of interrogation and Kelly later recanted. After 2 separate trials, he was acquitted. Henry Lee Moore. Henry Lee Moore was a suspected serial killer who was convicted of the murder of his mother and grandmother several months after the murders in Villisca. His weapon of choice? An axe. Before and after the murders in Villisca, the very similar axe murders of his mother and grandmother were committed, and all of the cases showed striking similarities, leading to a strong suspicion that some or all of the crimes were committed by the axe-murdering serial killer. Just like Blackie Mansfield, the axe-murdering Henry Moore can also be considered a suspect in some of these slayings. Paul Mueller. In their 2017 book, The Man from the Train, Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James discussed the Villisca murders as part of a much larger series of murders which they believe were all committed by a single serial killer. They conclude the murderer was Paul Mueller, an immigrant possibly from Germany who was the subject of an unsuccessful year-long manhunt as the sole subject in the 1897 murder of a family in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, who had employed him as a farmhand. James started his research in an attempt to solve the Villisca murders, and with his daughter found an archival newspaper story detailing dozens of families murdered under similar circumstances across the U.S. The Jameses thus believed that Mueller was guilty of the Villisca murders as part of a killing spree that lasted over a decade, killing at least 59 people in 14 separate incidents. The Jameses identify common features to these crimes, many of which are also found at the Villisca scene. The killers selected families who lived near railroad tracks, which is how the killer was suspected to have traveled. Used the blunt side of an axe rather than the blade to strike the victims in the head and face. Used an axe found at the victim's home and left in plain sight after the murders. Covered the victims with blankets to prevent blood splatter. Covered the windows from inside the house and locked the doors before departure. In Mueller's suspected crimes, there was often, but not always, a sexual motive directed towards a pubescent girl, as with Lena being partially disrobed. In a blurb on the dust jacket of the hardcover edition of The Man from the Train, professor and crime writer Harold Schechter, the Jameses offered the most probable solution yet for the Villisca murders. Over the next 2 decades, many people would confess to these murders. What do you think happened on that dreadful night in Villisca? Please drop your theories and thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing for all future uploads. Thanks.